I saw this reel on Instagram the other day that said consistency is the key to podcasting success. And the entire video was dedicated to talking about why consistency is so key in the podcasting journey. But the reality is you're being lied to, because consistency is only one part of the equation. And in today's episode, I'm going to break down why this is, and I'm going to give you the full equation that you need for long-term podcasting growth and success. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Is it just me, or have you ever noticed how just about every single podcast expert out there says that consistency is the key to podcasting success? But if consistency were the key, then you'd win the award because you've never missed releasing an episode, yet still your podcast is struggling to grow. And that's because consistency is only one part of the equation when it comes to podcast growth. It's kind of like going to the gym. If you were to go to the gym and lift the same weight every single day without giving any regard for sleep or for nutrition or for recovery or programming or hydration, well, if you know anything about fitness at all, you know that all those other activities are just as, if not more important to getting the results you want than actually picking up the dumbbell and curling it. So consistency isn't going to matter until you have the right activities dialed in. Just like you're not going to magically wake up tomorrow looking like a bodybuilder because you did a few bicep curls, growing a podcast doesn't just happen. Because if you're spending your time on the wrong things, you can be as consistent as you want to be, but you're not going to see results. So growing a podcast is not about being consistent. It's about consistently doing the right activities so you can get the results you want. And we've been doing some testing here on the podcast recently. You know me, I'm always testing things here behind the scenes so that I can pass on what works to you and help you avoid what doesn't work so you can save your time and energy and not waste your effort doing things that ultimately won't help you grow your show. And this past week, we were ranking number 16 in the how-to category in Canada. And it's pretty common to see our show in the top 200 and often in the top 100, but it wasn't always this way. And I think back to the early days of the podcast when I had no idea how to rank, or even what drove rankings. And it was so frustrating because I was doing everything that the podcast experts I followed were saying to do. I was putting out valuable content. I was doing it at least once a week. I had never missed a week of releasing an episode. I was emailing those episodes out to our list. I was sharing it on social media. And everyone says, just don't quit. Just stay in the game as long as possible. Well, I was in it. I was in the game and I was doing the things. And thankfully, at some point, I had this wake-up call and realized, wait a minute, not quitting is not a real strategy for podcast growth. And then that got me really curious to know what actually does drive podcast growth. I mean, we know on Apple, yes, if someone's following the show and if they're listening to your episodes and if they're downloading them and if they've left you a rating and written a review, that all signals to Apple that you've got engaged listeners and that can help drive your ability to rank on the charts. But what actually drives overall podcast growth? And what I found took me from struggling to grow past 100 downloads an episode to a global top 1% podcast host in less than 4 years. And look, these experts out there who are teaching podcasting and talking about podcast growth, they're not intentionally trying to mislead you. But until now, you have to understand something. Consistency, quote unquote, consistency, this just a consistent mantra, has been the industry standard for podcast growth. And it's been regurgitated over and over and over again, which is why you're sick of hearing it. And even more so because you've tried it and it doesn't work. Chances are there's got to be more. There's got to be something missing, because if consistency were the key, then everyone who's had their podcast for a year or more and released at least an episode a week without missing would have a top 100 podcast by now. And we both know that it's just not the case. So here is the full equation that you need for podcasting success. Very simply, it is right activity plus time equals momentum. This equation is the basis of the long-term growth formula, which makes up pillar 3 in our pod launch methodology. The time part is easy. That's the one that most of us, we know. We're in it for the long haul. We're here to podcast. We know that it's a commitment. We're going to stick in it as long as possible. But the right activity one is the one that trips people up. So I want you to think of it like this. Let's imagine you had $100,000 lying around, and you were going to go and invest that to make more money. Now, you can invest that into a number of different products, but let's just say for the sake of a simple example here, because look, I have a background in English literature, not in math or in finance. Let's say you were to just put that in a high yield savings account, and that account was earning you 5% interest annually. If you put that $100,000 in that account and you do nothing, well, at the end of a year, you'll make a little bit of money, or $5K. Now, if you continue to do nothing, and that interest rate stays the same, which we know it varies, but let's say it stays within that 5%, you're going to continue earning at or around that rate, even if you never put another dollar into that account. But let's say that every year you went and deposited another $100,000 into that account. And suddenly you were earning 5% on $200,000, plus the earnings, plus the next year, right? What you would earn and then how that compounds. And let's say you deposited $100,000 into that account every year. You would exponentially increase your results. Here's where most podcasters get this wrong. They make the initial investment. They buy the mic. They carve off time on their calendar to hit record. They set up the podcast. They start putting episodes out every week. And they think, well, as long as I have valuable content, people are going to find the show. It's going to spread. Word of mouth is going to spread. People are going to share this on their social media. They're going to share it with their friends. It's going to grow organically. And that's why they're so disappointed when they see only a little tiny bit of return for such a huge investment of their time that they're putting in. But what if you could accelerate the rate of return? And you can, just by going above and beyond the baseline investment of putting one episode out every week. Now, don't jump to conclusions and think that I'm saying put more time in or put more episodes out every week. Not necessarily. What I am saying is learn what the right activities are for your podcast, and then focus on doing more of those. The problem is most people don't know what the right activities are. They look around at other podcasts, big shows out there with hosts that we admire, that we aspire to be like, and they see all the reasons why their show stands almost no chance. Oh my gosh, Alex Hormozi. Well, he has a huge team. He's got $1 bajillion in the bank. He's got a big audience. He's got a big following. He's got plenty of time because he has that team, so he can put a lot of time into creating content and having a real high quality podcast. He's an expert. He's a thought leader. He's got all this money. He can spend that on professional agencies to help him grow or on ads to help him grow. But what I want you to realize is that for any top host who that might be their situation now, while some of that might be true now, likely wasn't the case in the early days of growing their podcast. So the question is, well, then what are the right activities that I need to be doing now so that I can get to a point where I can outsource more of my show processes and attract bigger guests and expand my thought leadership and reach a wider audience? So what I want you to understand is that, yes, you want to continue being consistent, but you want to also dial in what you're consistently doing. Because there's many things that you could do to grow a podcast. And I'm going to give you one activity right now that you could apply when you walk away from this episode to increase discoverability to your show, which is the basis of reaching new listeners. Now, I will caveat this and say that in order for this to work as effectively as possible, it'll be important to have the right messaging dialed in place first for your show and the right positioning as well, which this entire podcast and everything I teach is dedicated to helping you do. But if I had to go back and ask myself at the very beginning of my podcast, if I could only focus on one thing in addition to releasing an episode every week, I wouldn't start a YouTube channel. I wouldn't repurpose content on social media. I wouldn't send an email to my list every week. I wouldn't be posting in Facebook groups or going to industry conferences or joining a mastermind or signing up for more AI podcasting tools. I wouldn't even be pitching myself for PR opportunities or to speak at online summits. And I definitely would not be guesting on dozens of podcasts. But here's what I would do. And I'm going to give you two options, depending on how much budget you have and how much time you have. Let's just go ahead and assume you have zero budget and zero extra time. Well, then what you would want to look at doing is how can you begin to optimize and create more leverage from what you're already doing when it comes to putting an episode out there? Let me explain. Think about it. What is the number one way that listeners find new podcasts? Using search engines. Whether that's the in-app search feature, literally typing in a keyword into Apple Podcasts and looking for what comes up, or whether that's Googling or YouTubing XYZ podcast, best fitness podcasts, top motivational podcasts, best business podcasts for new business owners. The second way that new listeners find podcasts is the podcast charts. Now, if podcast growth is the goal, we want to make sure that we're getting your show continually in front of new listeners. It's not your warm audience that's going to help you grow your show, which is why sending an email out every week, every time you release an episode, and repurposing your content and sharing it on social media only goes so far when it comes to podcast growth. Because what that does is it just puts your podcast right back in front of the people who already know about it. But what we want to do is we want to get your show in front of new listeners who are cold to you. And if we know that the number one way that listeners are finding new podcasts is the search bar, and second to that is the podcast charts, well, then we want to optimize every opportunity, yes, to get you on the charts, but even more importantly, to show up in those listeners' searches. So without spending any extra time creating extra episodes, no bonus content, no additional episodes putting out per week, no ad spend, no budget at all, what I would do if it were my podcast would be to optimize every single episode title, show notes, show description, even my podcast name for keyword search. Now, there's tools out there that you can use to help you with this, especially if you have no background knowledge of SEO. ChatGPT can help you with this. And even though ChatGPT is not perfect, it's not the same as having someone with like incredible SEO knowledge come in and say, oh, you need to be using these keywords and to know which keywords are the best ones to go after and which ones are the least competitive, but the ones that people are likely searching for. Yeah, there's a lot that you could learn there, but you don't even have to. Because right now, if you're not optimizing these things for SEO at all, well, then one more step closer to doing that is one more step in the right direction. So ChatGPT can help with this. Or even better, there's a tool out there, Neil Patel's tool, Ubersuggest, and we'll link to that one in the show notes. But again, it goes back to what am I already doing that I can do better, that I can optimize, that I can create more leverage with. So going back to the beginning of my podcast, if there was only one right activity to focus on and I had zero budget, no extra time, I would start making my podcast more discoverable by optimizing through SEO. And maybe this is something you're doing to some degree right now, but maybe not as extensively as you could be. Now, here's another option. Let's assume you had a little bit of budget, but still not a lot of extra time. Well, one thing that you might want to do is use a tool like Siona to optimize your podcast website for SEO. Now, there's a little bit of cost associated with this, but if you have a podcast website and you have not optimized that for SEO, you're missing out on a lot of search engine traffic of listeners out there who might need your show but can't find you. But let's say you didn't want to touch SEO at all. Let's say you were like, you know what? I don't have a lot of time. I have a little bit of extra budget put aside that I can put behind my podcast. And I would like to maybe just run some ads or like, I don't know, should I do some podcast promotion? Should I do some swaps? Like, should I pay Buzzsprout to run ads to get my show in front of new listeners? And I would say, no, don't do any of that. But what I would say is look into a tool called Maupod. Now, if you haven't heard of this tool, this is a tool that often flies under the radar. And what Maupod is an agency that runs campaigns, ad campaigns, for some of the biggest and best, most well-known podcasts. But what they've also done is they've created an interface that independent podcasters can use as well. Now, if you wanted to put a little bit of money behind your show, then I would say go back into your analytics and look at the best performing episodes you have. These are clues into what your listeners are really interested in, and it's likely that there are other listeners out there who don't know about you yet who would be interested in those topics too. So what I would say is pick one of them and put a little bit of money into Maupod to promote that episode to more listeners who would be likely to listen. Now, the beautiful thing about Maupod is they're all in compliance with the IAB standards, which if you don't know what those are, basically you never want to go on Fiverr or anywhere and just pay someone to say like, hey, send me downloads, because what they could do is connect your podcast with like this bot farm and all these robots and AI tools. And like, yes, you're getting downloads, but actually Apple is shadow banning you because they can tell if it's a real person that's listened versus if it's a robot that's listened, and they can see how long people are listening and whether they're engaging with your show. But Maupod runs based on the IAB industry standard. And all downloads, like the downloads that Buzzsprout tracks and Libsyn tracks, these are all IAB certified downloads. That's what you want. You want real listeners listening to your podcasts. So for a few bucks, Malpod will help you promote your episodes to more real listeners who not only are likely to listen, but that would be likely to convert into a listener of your show. Now, we've tested Malpod. I do not run this on every single episode, but if you've got some episodes that really picked up some traction for you and you were like, okay, well, that seemed to be really popular with people, that I would encourage you, if you have a little bit of budget, but you don't have a ton of extra time, like to go guesting on other podcasts to get your show in front of new listeners, try a tool like this. And we'll link to it in the show notes for you. But here's the bottom line of all of this, because there's a lot you can do to grow a podcast. There's a lot of activities that could be the right activities for you. And the reality is the right activity is going to be different from host to host, because no two podcast hosts' goals are the exact same. They might be similar. But if you have a podcast that ultimately you're using to convert listeners to leads for your business, well, you're going to have different goals than another host who's doing that, because you have different businesses, you have different lives and lifestyles, and you have different aspirations and different dreams. So it'll take some work to identify what the right activity is for you. But regardless, you don't have to go out there and do 100 things. Essentially, what you want to do is, first of all, establish your baseline, which you've already done. You've already put in that initial investment. And if you haven't started your podcast yet, when you launch it, you will have put in that initial investment. Now, in order for it to yield the greatest return, we don't want to just let the investment sit there by just continuing to do the baseline minimum of putting out one episode a week and doing nothing else. We want to get to work to know what the right activity is for you, where the lightest lift is for you. That's where you want to focus first in order to optimize and create leverage with what you're already doing so that you're not adding anything extra to your plate. And then from there, as you begin to look at the data and look at what the data is actually telling you as far as what activities are working, then you can begin to layer in one strategy on top of another, on top of another. And that's where we begin to create leveraged growth and momentum over the long term. So yes, you got to give it time. Time and consistency, sure, but that's only one part of the equation. So if it was refreshing for you to hear someone give you permission to give up this mantra of just stay consistent, then leave a review, let me know. And if you feel like you need help with any of this, dialing in your messaging or your show positioning or having someone look over your shoulder at what you're doing with your podcast and figuring out, well, what is the right activity that you need to be focusing on? What are some activities that maybe you can give up right now that aren't serving your show, unbeknownst to you? And what are the activities that maybe you need to be doing? Then I would encourage you, head to the show notes, book a call with my team. We are here to help. We will audit your podcast for free and show you the gaps from where you are now to where you want to be, why those gaps are happening, and how we might be able to help you fix them. So if this episode was valuable for you, then stick around, because in the next episode, I'm going to show you how to dig into your podcast data and show you how to identify your most popular episode topics simply by looking at your listener behavior. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.